My name is Greg Caswell. Today's talk's on baited canaries. This talk is a little bit on the shorter side, so we'll get you out of here and over to the bull riding fairly quickly. The team I'm responsible for over Indeed is your typical AppSec variety collection of things: red teams, bug bounty, vulnerability assessments, design reviews. And as he mentioned, outside of work, I do enjoy aquaponics, beekeeping, gaming, etc. So Indeed's purpose is to help people get jobs, and we've been pretty successful at it. So successful that Indeed's currently the #1 job site in the world. But running a successful site on the internet comes with some downsides. For today's talk, we'll be covering 2 different common attack scenarios that you might run across, and how you can use canaries in those attacks to gain more information about who's attacking your systems, as well as identifying what users may have been attacked. But before we get into those scenarios, let's just define canaries real quick. Historically speaking, canaries are an allusion to a caged bird that miners would take into mines with them. If dangerous gases, such as carbon monoxide, were present in the mine, the gases would kill the bird first, thus alerting the miners that something's wrong, and they'd hightail it out of there as quickly as possible. Within InfoSec, they can be thought of as a type of honeypot, typically used within production systems rather than a simulated system. And they also usually utilize some sort of canary token to track compromise. Canary and honey tokens are just some unique bits of string that should only ever exist in a single location. And if you ever find those tokens in any other location at all, you know someone's been tampering around in your stuff. But you don't necessarily know who or when they did that. Active canaries just take that single-use signal and instead use something more intelligent or persistent. So that's what we'll call an active canary. In general, why do canaries work at all? Well, attackers aren't perfect, like most people, with present company excluded, I'm sure. And they may not realize that the data they're taking or the systems they're accessing might be telling on them, so to speak. So for our first attack scenario, I'm sure you're familiar with phishing sites being used to steal users' credentials. In our case, an attacker might spin up a Indeed.com lookalike domain to target both our job seekers and employers. Beyond just collecting credentials that can be reused anywhere else, our accounts themselves have value to the attackers. For example, with compromised employer accounts, an attacker can reliably scam job seekers through various iterations of like fake check cashing schemes or just stealing their information for user identity theft later. Or even just with a job seeker account, they can use that to attack employers themselves by submitting malicious resumes outside of our normal resume flow, or just to send spam. Unfortunately, protecting the trust and safety of our users is difficult when they aren't even on our site. We might not even find out about the phishing until long after the attacker has collected a bunch of credentials and accessed a ton of accounts. The typical way you might find out about a phishing campaign is either through a user email saying, hey, I clicked on a site and submitted my creds, I think it was a phishing site. Or maybe you've got some automated tools that kind of look for some look-alike domains that exist out on the internet. But neither of those are ideal scenarios. It's very much like closing the barn door after the horse is bolted. So what can we do about this? Well, the basic idea is to include a piece of JavaScript or even CSS on pages that attackers are likely to clone for their phishing attacks. This beacon can provide information about what domains that JavaScript is then hosted on, as well as what users are submitting information through the fake login form. So let's dig into some of those implementation details. So for exfiltration, DNS is still a fantastic option, especially when you're working in browser land. You don't typically focus on anything other than the HTTP requests going back and forth, and may not be breaking out Wireshark to see what sort of DNS requests are going out from this site you've cloned. To ship the DNS requests themselves from JavaScript, there are a few different options to choose from, but the most straightforward is probably DNS prefetch. The legitimate use case for this is just to pre-cache DNS mapping, but we will use it to ship information via the subdomain itself. Do keep in mind that DNS has some constraints or some gotchas that you should keep in mind. It is case insensitive, so normal encoding schemes such as base64 need to be modified or exchanged for something else. And there are various length restrictions on both the URL, the length of each subdomain, or even the number of subdomains. Since this piece of JavaScript will be hosted on one of our production sites, we will want to avoid triggering billions of legitimate page views that we see per month. So we need to add some sort of check around our canary so it only triggers on an unexpected domain. In this example, this canary might be hosted on www.indeed.com, and if it sees any domain that isn't that, then it'll go and continue its alerting service. Optionally, if detecting what victims fall prey to phishers, you could add an event listener on the form submit so that you know exactly which users submit information through the fake login form. And if you care about Internet Explorer users, you can add that catch clause. So at its simplest, a passive canary may end up looking something like this. You've got your domain check at the very start, wrapping everything. You create your DNS prefetch element, and you add your domain where the payload is the information you want to ship off. And the moment you append that to the body, the DNS request goes out, and as long as you've set up an appropriate listener for that DNS request, you will get that payload into your systems. If you want to implement a more active canary, your payload should likely include a few more elements to ensure reliable transmission and collection. As an example, this is close to something we use. At the very beginning is some sort of random nonce to, for the most part, cache bust to make sure your requests reliably go out. But it also serves as a semi-unique identifier for stitching together multi-part packets. Because keep in mind, you can only ship so much information per DNS request. Speaking of multi-part packets, this is just the way we use to signify which packet of the set this is coming in. This is saying this is packet 1 of 5. And the system on the back end can then take that semi-unique identifier and just stitch those back together and get your entire payload collected into a single blob. And then for the information you actually want to ship back itself, since base64 is not an option, base32 works. Base32 is just base64 with half the symbols to work with. But it's enough symbols to ship through DNS. The way you encode your data is up to you. We just went with some JSON encoding and then wrapped that in base32, chopped it up into appropriate sizes, and then shipped it out in the necessary number of packets. And then finally, for the domain, use whatever domain you like, as long as you can control it and you can point your custom bind server, or point it at your custom bind server. So you actually get those DNS requests. So to review how this baited canary helps us, let's look at the typical timeline for a phishing attack. It can be kind of thought of in 5 different steps. You've got planning, where the attacker is actually figuring out who they want to attack, how they want to attack them. Staging, where they actually set up the phishing site, as well as any communication mechanisms they need in place. Then they go and advertise their fake phishing page via Twitter, direct links, forums, whatevers. Finally, they will harvest the victim's credentials and then reuse those credentials however they choose. Without a canary, the usual way to learn about phishing attacks against your users is simply to hear about it from phishing reports, or outside of that, if you've got some decent suspicious login logic, you can potentially identify compromised accounts when they try to log in that way. But neither of those signals are great. And then with the canary in place, you shift left. You get a clear signal the second a cloned login page is hosted, even on the attacker's machine. Because the moment they clone the page, maybe they're running it on a local host, or maybe they're running it on their test domain, but you will get the signal immediately before any victims visit the site. And if you add additional logic on form submit, you can also just collect the list of users who are compromised. So it just allows you to take some preemptive actions much quicker than without the canary. For our second attack scenario is about third parties misusing G Suite permissions. Because it is hard to know in G Suite land exactly what plugins or services are using the information appropriately and to the user's desire, or if they're doing more malicious things with that information. It's kind of a hard problem to get at, but as an example, some of you may remember a Google Doc phishing event that affected about 1 million accounts a couple of years ago. The basic problem was that since people were used to trusting whatever access an app requested within Google's OAuth, when a malicious app came along, people approved access no problem, and this spread pretty crazy fast. This one was kind of easier to identify in hindsight, but the thing to keep in mind is with a lot of malicious apps, you may not even have these signals to go on for how it's misusing the information you're granting it. So how can canaries help here? Well, since that event, Google has actually come a long way with some of their auditing features. And one of them can be used to set up some canary-like alerts. There are still some gaps that make it a little tricky, but we'll walk through how you can set up those alerts fairly quickly. First step is you generate some bait files named anything that you think an attacker might find interesting. Mergers and acquisition plans 2020, or finance credit card copies. Just anything that is likely someone's going to search for if they're trying to get juicy information from a G Suite account. You take those bait files and you add them to users' drives. Again, your naming choice may be important here. Maybe you don't want the name to be very interesting at all, because the attacker may just be siphoning off all files. And so you may want to choose a name that's very uninteresting, just so that a legitimate user doesn't, for whatever reason, go through the entirety of the G Suite files and see what they have in there. And then once you've got the files added, within Google's admin console, you will create an alert around access to that file. So within Google Admin, there's a button for reports. If you click through into there and do a filter for the files you've added, there's a button for setting alert. You set the alert name to whatever you like. The event, typically you'd set that to view, but if you want some other event to trigger the alert, that's fine as well. Add an email that you want these alerts to siphon to. Probably not your personal email. Maybe you want to set up a group that's got a tie-in to the rest of your alerting systems at your company, so that those alerts don't get lost. And when you save, you're good to go. Once you Once that alert's set, you may want, the message it gives you isn't very enlightening. It'll tell you an IP and a time, but not much else. If you want to dig deeper, you go into the OAuth token audit log. This is really hard to see. I'll zoom in a little bit here, and also somewhat redacted. But the idea is it gives you what token is accessing exactly what permission on behalf of what user, as well as from what IP and at what time, and the application name it's associated with. And so using that complete set of information, you can have a much better idea of what application is misbehaving and accessing files that you would not expect it to access. So to review, you create a bait file, add them to users' drives, create a filter in your Google admin audit view, and set an alert on that view. Ideally, this gives you the ability to detect certain misbehaving G Suite apps. Hopefully, you were able to get a few ideas of other ways to use active canaries. As you think about the various paths attackers could take in your systems, you may find there are a ton of different contexts that active canaries could be useful in and could apply the same methods to good effect. Special thanks to Christina and Adi for work in creating and debugging some of these implementations. So the question was, why DNS and not just use a GET over HTTP? I mentioned it briefly, but when you clone a page, if you want to do some due diligence to make sure it's not sending out login information about yourself, you'll typically look at the requests that go out in your browser. And the requests that you can see within your browser's console are just HTTP requests or maybe some WebSocket requests, but it doesn't show DNS requests within your web view. The same is true for any web proxy. They'll be set up to show basically everything but DNS requests. And so DNS was just used because it's one step harder to see, and so slightly less likely that the attacker will figure out where that's coming from and remove it. The second thing you can add to it, though, is the request itself can be disguised to look like something legitimate. So for example, if your domain looks like indeedcdn.com, then that's something you'd probably expect an Indeed.com site to utilize in their normal usage. For example, if you're talking like PDFs, docx, those are active file types and actually run JavaScript directly, and so you can just dump the same thing into those file types as well. Otherwise, it depends on the file type and what kind of things might be running that file. Free aside, the management's usually the biggest cost. The reason I have a strong distaste towards third parties handling canary tokens is one of the big features of canary tokens should be that token should only ever exist in a single place. And if you have a third party helping you create and manage and place those tokens, you've already failed, because now the third party and that place have the token. And so if that token is ever triggered, you don't know if it was you that was compromised or the third party that was compromised. Now, it's possible the third party service has a way to ensure that they never actually touch the token themselves, but I haven't run across one that goes that route. There's layers you can add. For example, there's CSS-based canaries you can use as well, but they're less featureful. But you could layer a CSS canary just to watch whether or not the JavaScript canary fires off. And if the JavaScript canary fails to fire off, then the CSS canary fires off instead. And so you could do some tricks like that, but otherwise it's kind of hard to know who successfully finds your alert and rips it out. Cool. All right. Thank you all for coming out.